Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of The Squad Room. I'm your host, Garrett Teslaw. I'm an active duty patrol sergeant in Southern California. The Squad Room is about developing, optimizing, and maintaining the health and wellness of law enforcement around the world. Health and wellness mean a lot of things, and I explore it all here. How can we maintain and improve our physical health, our emotional health, our mental health, our mindfulness? The show is my journey as a law enforcement officer trying to get healthier by evaluating my own life and by getting better at the things that I think are important. I reach out to experts to see what I can learn from them. I talk to other cops, doctors, military leaders, even meditation experts, anyone who can be a force multiplier in my fitness. Today's guest was also our guest in episode 10, Dr. Kirk Parsley. Kirk is a former Navy SEAL. He spent 6 years in the teams before going to medical school while still in the Navy. And then he went back to the teams as the team physician. And I'm not going to go into his whole backstory because I suggest you listen to episode 10, which you can get obviously on iTunes and at thesquadroom.net/episode 10. And you can listen to his story there. And in that first episode, we really get into a lot of the minutia of why sleep is important. And anybody listening to this who works shift schedules and is a law enforcement officer knows how little sleep we get, how poor the sleep that we do get is, and the detrimental effects it has on our relationships, on our physical health, on our nutrition, all those things. So go back to episode 10 to listen to more about what he has to say. But we'll jump into the episode here in just a minute. We have a long discussion with him about adrenal fatigue, metabolic syndrome, the blood work you should be doing with your doctor, how to talk to your doctor about these things, and also this idea that even though he is a doctor, that he says that they're called healthcare practitioners or healthcare providers, but they're really disease care providers. They're not wellness providers, and he gives some good tips on some good people on who to follow, on who he endorses as being leaders in wellness, not just in disease prevention. So check out the notes for this episode at thesquadroom.net. And you'll see all the show notes that we have and links to some of his work. I'll link to his TEDx talk again. That was fantastic. And I'll link to some of the resources that he puts out there. Before we get to Dr. Parsley, I want to thank SB Tactical and the iCombat Active Shooter Training System for their support of this show. The iCombat Training System is an active shooter qualification and firearms qualification system. And it doesn't require any site prep or ammo costs. And it's completely mobile, which is really the most amazing thing about it. It functions much like laser tag does. I forget the military word for it is, but it sounds way cooler when you use the military slang for it. But essentially, each officer is outfitted with gear and sensors that go over any uniform combination that you might have because it's fully adjustable. The iCombat package is a replica AR-15 and a replica Glock pistol that both function much like real firearms. They're weighted, they have muzzle flash and gunshot sounds and ammo accountability. And you can take this entire system and move it anywhere and put it into any building. We used a functioning office building when my department went through this training about a year and a half, 2 years ago for the first time. It's got all the benefits and none of the liabilities of Sims training. Los Angeles PD, Boston SWAT, and many other agencies have been using it to do active shooter, especially active shooter on college campuses. I've been seeing a lot in their Instagram feed about the ability to take this onto a college campus, and you don't have to shut the whole place down, and you don't have to put up tarps, and you don't have to have safe zones because everything about it is safe, and it's really applicable there. So check them out at sbtactical.com. All right, stick around for the show. This is Dr. Kirk Parsley. You can find him on Twitter at Doc Parsley, D-O-C, Parsley, like the herb. And his website is docparsley.com. Again, everything is in the show notes, but here's Doc Parsley. Dr. Kirk Parsley, thanks for being back on the show. Haven't told you this yet, but you're actually our first return guest.
All right.
Yeah.
First it's something.
So awards in the mail.
We should stop now then so I don't screw it up.
I highly doubt that you're going to do that because last episode you were on, episode 10, which was way back when. It was about a year ago. I was just getting this started. And your episode remains one of the most popular episodes that I have, which tells me that this is an issue that is universal, and it's obviously very applicable to my audience in law enforcement. And more questions remain. So on that podcast, you offered to come back on at any point and go deeper into some other issues. So I took you up on that, and you jumped at the chance to come back on. So thank you again for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure, man.
You've a lot's changed for you in the last year. You just finished Paleo FX down in Austin, and you got a new website that we'll get into in a little bit. But I want to go to a question. It's a follow-up question from a different guest, but something you've touched on a little bit in episode 10, but in other stuff you've done, you touch on it quite a bit. But here I want to get into it. We had a cardiologist on, a fellow Texan, Dr. John Scheinberg, who's also a lieutenant with Cedar Park Police right there in that area. And he was talking about metabolic syndrome in relation to fat, in relation to heart disease. My follow-up question to you is, what is metabolic syndrome in sense of its relationship to sleep, and how dangerous is that combination?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most accurate way to think of metabolic syndrome, although it's a little bit more than this, the most sort of accurate gestalt for the lay audience would be to think of it as sort of pre-diabetes. So you run into some insulin sensitivity issues. Those insulin sensitivity issues have cascades of events, and one of those events is that you're going to maintain more body fat. You're going to have more inflammation. That higher inflammation is going to increase your risk of forming atherosclerotic plaques, or the bad stuff in your vessels that end up ripping off and clogging your arteries. Anytime you have insulin sensitivity issues, you run into wild blood glucose fluctuations, and when you have chronic inflammation and wild blood glucose fluctuations, you also tend to have aberrant adrenal hormones or stress hormones. The excess body fat also leads to sex hormone issues that I won't talk about just yet, unless you want to bring that out specifically. But the excess stress hormones then increase your resting heart rate, they increase your blood pressure, they decrease the perfusion to the frontal lobe of your brain, which is kind of your decision-making area, your little simulator there. And all of those things just continue to cascade down the course of any number of diseases. There's kind of a big push, or not a big push, but there's kind of a movement to start calling. There are a lot of people who are starting to call Alzheimer's disease type 3 diabetes. So you're looking at neurological decay, cardiovascular decay, and body composition decay, right? So kind of all the bad stuff that leads to pretty much every disease known to man. So you're just sick. I mean, you're just unwell. I mean, that's all there is to it.
So sorry, go ahead.
Sorry about that phone ringing. Hopefully you can edit that out. But
I'm not that fancy, but it's all good.
I didn't realize I had a phone in here.
You're in your house, right? You didn't break into someone else's house.
It's my office. If you saw this place, there's so much crap piled up. I don't even know where it's at. I'm looking for it right now, but whatever. It'll stop ringing. No, that's good enough.
Okay, so insulin resistance, then that seems to come up a lot with every kind of different doctor that I speak with, and it all seems to relate back to dietary carbohydrate intake. Is that right? And
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a big factor of it. So insulin sensitivity issues happen for two reasons. One is that you're eating a lot of carbohydrates. And if you're eating a lot of carbohydrates and you have really high blood glucose, then your pancreas secretes more insulin to try to get that glucose into the cells. And most people think of that as being the sole job of insulin. That's not the only job of insulin, but insulin is actually one of the major hormones. What it's really responsible for is what's called fuel partitioning. So it really decides what you're going to do with everything that you put in your body, and it decides how you're going to make fuel for everything that you do. So every cell in your body is sensitive to insulin to some degree. Your brain, of course, can only use blood glucose, so it doesn't really need insulin receptors, but everywhere else in your body stocked with insulin receptors. So if you have high blood glucose all the time, then you have tons of glucose receptors on all your cells, and you have tons of insulin receptors. And then when insulin starts coming around all the time, and there's a ton of insulin around, then you start downregulating your receptors. And then when there's a ton of glucose all the time, you start downregulating those receptors. And now you're not as sensitive to either one of those things. So now it's harder for insulin to get the glucose into your cells, so your body starts making more insulin. Conversely, if you don't ever use your muscles, if you don't exercise very much, then they don't have a big demand, they don't have a big draw, so they don't have as many insulin receptors because they don't need as much energy. So that's why they tell you that diet and exercise. And exercise probably isn't the right word. It's just activity. Like you have to use your meat suit for something other than carrying your brain around. You have to use it or you lose it, right? So that's if there were one, if you said you would give me one single lab to judge somebody's health, I would say give me their fasting insulin.
Fasting insulin, is that different than fasting glucose?
I can give you the most information off of that of any single lab.
And sorry, I don't know if the connection cut out.
You still there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Hello. That lose you. Okay, I can hear you now.
You got me
moving again.
All right, yeah, I think we cut out for when I asked to follow up. So is fasting insulin the same as fasting glucose?
No, but they're correlated, or they should be correlated. They can when they're discordant, or what we call them, then that's an even worse worse case scenario. The insulin is really just that. We can measure directly that molecule, how many of those molecules you have in your blood when we take your blood, and at the same time we usually measure how much blood glucose you have, because we traditionally don't just pull a single lab. But those two should be correlated. If you have a ton of insulin and a ton of blood glucose, it's probably type 2 diabetes. And the higher those two numbers go, the closer you are. And what you find is that people who have really low insulin numbers tend to have really low, or at least really well controlled blood glucose, because if they didn't have good blood glucose control, then they would be making more insulin.
I want to get into the blood work question a little bit deeper, but I want to make sure I ask this question so I don't forget. But what is a blood glucose level that to you would really concern you?
Well, I mean that varies widely on the client that I'm working with. So, if I have a 45-year-old guy who's been working himself to death for the past 20 years, trying to trading his health for wealth for 20 years, and now he's 40 pounds overweight, and he comes to me and he says, I want to get back in shape. I want to be the same guy I was when I was a college athlete, right? And that's what they all say, every single one of them. I want to be just like I was in college when I was a D1, whatever. And I'm like, let's set some different expectations to start with. Maybe we'll get there one day. But if that guy comes in with a 120 or 125, like over 125 should be diabetic, should be diagnosed as diabetic. And we can talk about why I wouldn't call it diabetes. But for somebody like that, I would say if he was much over 125, I would be much more aggressive with his treatment. But for like a healthy athletic guy, I don't really like to see it over kind of 95-ish. I mean, a really well controlled blood glucose is somewhere between 80 and 95, and if it's 75, so much the better. Like I don't care if your insulin's low and your blood glucose is down there. Like you're saving yourself from all sorts of disease. One of the things that glucose does, and you can see this pattern in diabetics, right? The reason diabetics get ulcers on their feet and end up getting pieces of their feet cut off and eventually even their legs cut off, is because blood glucose is processed by an enzyme called glycosylase, and that enzyme is found in a couple of places. One, it's found in red blood cells, and another place it's found is in nerve tissue. So what this really does is form like little crystals of glucose that are, if you've ever done fiberglass work and insulation work or something like that,
sure,
you get that in your fingers, and so you think of that same process really going on in a red blood cell. And so when you get down to the capillary levels, red blood cells go through one by one, like they literally single file slide through a capillary. So if they have these sharp little shards of crystal on them, then they cut that wall, and that wall inflames and hemorrhages, and then that capillary closes off. And you do that a couple of hundred times, and then you lose blood flow to that area. And now you have the stagnant pool of blood, and you have a lot of glucose in there. It's warm, and bacteria grow. The reason they can't feel it is because their nerves are being damaged by the same process, by the glycosylase in their nerve endings, so they can't feel that. So that's a couple of the bad things going on with glucose right there. Not to mention the neurological decay that it does in your brain.
So off topic now, but is that why people end up losing appendages or limbs due to diabetes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because they don't feel that infection.
I always wondered what that connection was.
And then that infection just festers and festers and festers, and they don't even see it until it manifests itself on the skin, and it could be 2 inches deep in their foot, and they're not going to know that it's there until their skin starts showing signs for it. And at that point, it's oftentimes too late, because once you get necrosis of the bone, once it starts killing the bone, then you have to cut that out, because you'll never regain vascularization to that bone and fix it, and you're just going to always have problems. So cut off a toe, then they cut off part of your foot, and then they just chop all the way up,
All right, so I took us down the rabbit hole a bit off topic here, so but to bring this back to glucose and sleep, what's a high carbohydrate diet, or maybe that's not even the only factor, but how do those things then relate to poor sleep or I'll say sleep nutrition or sleep hygiene?
Well, so sleep hygiene really refers to a couple of things that are getting your brain ready for bed. One of those is the light saturation, which everybody talks about, blue light going into your eyes. The other one is slowing down your brain. Another factor that's supposed to happen is that you're supposed to become progressively less aware of your environment. And if you aren't becoming less aware of your environment, if you're out at a bar, say, you're becoming more aware of your environment, then your brain overrides that light saturation shift that you worked so hard to achieve. And that's largely controlled by a neurotransmitter called GABA. So that's somewhat of a separate issue, but when the light saturation issue is taken into account, it really affects what's called the master clock, or the suprachiasmatic nucleus. You've probably heard of that. The master clock, we'll just call it, much simpler. The SCN is a job security word. Just keep it confusing for everybody, and we'll stay in business. So the master clock in the brain does lots of changes to neurotransmitters in your brain, and those neurotransmitters in your brain, especially like down in your basal lizard brain, then dictate what hormones are going out into your body and how your body is reacting, and decreases stress hormones and does all sorts of things. So your diet is directly related to your ability to sleep, and your diet is directly related to your hormones, and vice versa. Those things are the two sides of the same coin, right? Like you can't separate those things out. So where blood glucose comes in the most powerfully with sleep, if you just want to talk about something simplistic, and the reason I'm kind of stuttering through this is because it's super complex, and I'm trying to make it sound simple and palatable.
Sure.
But there's really about 30 or 40 different things going on here. But here's a really simplistic way to approach this. think about every other animal on this planet uses the sun to guide its sleep-wake cycles. And the only animal on this planet that intentionally sleep deprives itself is humans. But every other animal on this planet will sleep deprive themselves under one condition, that they're starving. When you're starving, your brain registers this really low blood glucose, and you wake up earlier and you stay up later, and that's to allow you to travel further and get more food. The other thing that it does is it kind of shuts down again that prefrontal cortex that we were talking about, the decision maker, and makes you less risk averse because you need to try to eat novel things. You need to go closer to humans or whatever it is to get more food to survive. So if you have poor insulin sensitivity, people always think of that as meaning that you have really high blood glucose all the time, which is by and large true, but what it really means is that you have wild shifts in your blood glucose. So if your blood glucose is going up and down in very rapid manner, your brain perceives the absolute change. So it doesn't matter if you have a fasting blood glucose of 150, if it shoots down to 100, which would be high for me, my brain's going to go, holy crap, we're starving, and it's going to wake me up. So people who start low carbohydrate diets, low carbohydrate, high fat, high protein, or ketotic diet or something, oftentimes have problems sleeping for the first 2 to 3 months because they don't have good insulin sensitivity, and they've taken away their carbohydrate supply, and so now they're getting this blood glucose crash when they're sleeping, and their brain's going, oh crap, we need to wake up, and stress hormones are rising, and they have these really high AM stress cortisol levels, and then they get up early. So that's the clearest association. Hopefully I made sense there.
Yeah.
I felt like I talked in a circle. But.
No. So I guess my follow-up to then is, so if someone's looking to, change their fitness, change their nutrition, and they want to, and they're on a, kind of your standard American fare diet right now, and they want to investigate a low-carb diet or something that's even a Mediterranean diet or something that's less carbohydrate-centric, but they don't want to have that problem with sleeping, is there a way to, do you taper, or is there a supplement, or how would you suggest they do that?
Yeah, I would say you handle that by making sure that your sleep hygiene and sort of your lifestyle, the 4 pillars of your life, so we're talking about sleep, but then your nutrition, your exercise, and your stress mitigation are all kind of perfect. And then you have a really good sleep ritual that's super tight, and you're very disciplined around that. And then supplement if you need to. You might need to supplement until the insulin receptors come back. You might need to take some sort of, sleep supplement. And of course, I have one I prefer, but there's lots of good things out there. And you take a sleep supplement, 2-3 months or whatever. And even if you aren't getting great sleep, just know that it's the better decision in the long run is to improve your diet, and your sleep will improve, especially. What we find in standard American fare, both men and women, is really low levels of testosterone. And when we were doing research, when I was still with the SEALs as their physician, we documented a very, very strong correlation, not exactly 1-to-1, but it was like a 0.78 or 0.79 correlation of total testosterone and total time of sleep. So the lower your testosterone, the less you slept, and the less you slept, the lower your testosterone. So those hormones repair when you start eating better and exercising better and sleeping more and all that stuff. So,
and what you mentioned the last time you were on that, I'm going to screw this up, but that when your body starts to produce less testosterone when you're sleeping, it actually increases estrogen. Is that, and then your body is increasing more estrogen, so and the two are related, so it's telling your brain basically, well, we have this much estrogen in our body, so we must be making enough testosterone, and it kind of is this downward spiral. Is that, am I getting that roughly right?
Yeah. So there's sort of this switchboard in your brain, and we call it the hypothalamus, where it's sort of the master control center, and it's sensing what's going on, and it's giving feedback to the rest of the brain to secrete this neurotransmitter, secrete these pro hormones or these hormones or whatever. The big women are different. Women have aromatase in a lot of tissues. And aromatase is an enzyme that converts testosterone into estrogen. But men, the primary place we hold that, and I'd have to go back and research that. It might be the only place, but I know the primary place we have aromatase is in our subcutaneous fat. So the fat we dislike when we see in the mirror that keeps us from having six-pack abs or whatever, that fat is converting testosterone into estrogen. Unfortunately, the switchboard determines our testosterone level by measuring our estrogen level because it should be a normal ratio. And so, there are testosterone receptors in the brain, but there's just nowhere near as many as there are estrogen receptors. So it's kind of the primary determinant. So if your brain says, well, we have a ton of estrogen, we must have a ton of testosterone. So then your brain doesn't secrete as much of the hormone called luteinizing hormone that tells your testicles to make more testosterone. So now you produce even less testosterone, which then means you get fatter, and then more of your testosterone converts. And so, I see it all the time. Guys come in with, testosterone, at the very low end of normal, and almost every time they're at the very low end of normal or even slightly below normal range, their estrogen is at the high end of normal or above the normal range. And they've really expanded what the normal range is for men. Even over the time I've been a doctor, they've actually doubled the quote-unquote normal range. So I think it should only be about 20 to 25 because that's kind of what the data showed 50 years ago. That was pretty normal. And now we have all these environmental toxins, and I'm going to put us in a whole new tangent with that. But, the things like in the plastics, the BPAs and all that, those are pseudoestrogens or xenoestrogens, and they act like estrogen in our body, and they cause these same kind of problems.
So this was actually a listener question then about testosterone was what's the relationship to sleep, or why when you have bad sleep, how does that kick off a reduction of testosterone?
Well, about 90 to 95% of all of the testosterone you make at night, or you make in a 24-hour period, you make during deep sleep. So if you are getting poor sleep, then your body isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing. There's this common misconception that if somebody's laying in bed and their eyes are closed and they're snoring and they don't seem aware of their environment, then they're asleep. That's not necessarily true. We have to look at their brain waves and say, let me back up. They probably are asleep, but they may not be in the right stage of sleep. They may not have what we call normal sleep architecture, meaning that they aren't going from stage 1 down to 2, down to 3 and 4 and staying there for a while and then coming back up and then going into a little REM and then going back down. So when we're in the stages 3 and 4, we also call that slow wave sleep, is when we're secreting the vast majority of testosterone that we're going to secrete. And if you're not very active, it's probably 100% of the testosterone that you're going to secrete. But the more active you are, and especially sort of anaerobic threshold training, you'll secrete a little more testosterone during the day, both through some LH pulses and also some conversion of DHEA into testosterone.
Do you find, like my wife wears a Fitbit at bedtime to track her sleep. Do you find those to be relatively accurate or useful? Or, what's a good way for people to know? Or is it just physiologically they know that they're getting good sleep or that right level or stage of sleep?
Yeah, they're not super helpful for me as a physician, other than to just sort of encourage the patient to value their sleep and to measure it. They're not perfect, but they're better than nothing, right? And as the old adage goes, if you don't measure it, you can't improve it. And so if people, our subjective experience of sleep is usually very inaccurate. So if anytime you see sleep data where they surveyed people about how many hours they slept, you just throw it away. Like, don't even read anything else. As soon as you read that, it's like people are wildly off. We have people will come in to me all the time and say, I don't sleep at all. I lay in bed and I toss and turn and I toss and turn. I don't think I even sleep 10 minutes in an 8-hour night. And then, of course, at this point in my career, I know that's pretty unlikely, but it has been true a few times. But usually you put those people in for a sleep study and they're sleeping 6.5, 7 hours, and they just never feel asleep. They're always somewhat aware of their environment, and that's kind of one of the cues for being asleep. And then they, oftentimes they don't have normal sleep architecture, so they aren't getting the restorative sort of love that that sleep is supposed to impart on you. And so, in one sense, they're right. They really aren't. They aren't in the right stages of sleep, at least.
Mm-hmm. So this is kind of a related question. Then I read something the other day on I forget where exactly, but it was a discussion about metabolism and eating during, especially for shift workers, eating during the hours when you're supposed to be asleep, and how the body fights the food that you're intaking at work. So obviously, if I'm working from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. and I've got to eat at least twice within that, typically, what is my metabolism doing during those nighttime hours versus a normal person who was, sun up to sunrise? All right, sun up to sunset.
Yeah. Well, that you're putting me in a box for that one. That's a pretty complex question, but it would depend on a couple of variables. Well, if it was a single night of, you say you're usually running from sun up to sundown as your MO, and then you just pull one night shift, totally screwed, right? Your metabolism, your circadian rhythm hasn't shifted at all, and your body is, there's this common misconception that circadian rhythm's all in your brain. It's in every cell of your body. Every single cell of your body has a biological clock, and it's performing one way when it believes the body's awake, and it's performing a different way when it thinks the body's asleep or should be asleep. A great example of that is renal function. One of the reasons that people with poor sleep have to get up so many times during the night to go to the bathroom is because your renal function, if you have good sleep architecture, if you're aligned with your circadian rhythm, your renal function goes down about 50% during sleep. So you aren't producing as much urine, so you don't have to get up and go to the bathroom. If you're in crappy sleep or getting unreal sleep because you used alcohol or sleep drugs or something, and you're not truly sleeping, it doesn't affect your adrenal hormones. But every tissue in your body is behaving that way. So insulin sensitivity, like we talked about, that's a big one. So what your body is doing with the food that you're eating on that shift is determined by your insulin sensitivity. Your insulin is fuel partitioning that and figuring out where to put it, what to do with it. Use it right now for energy, store it with fat, put it inside of lean tissues. What are we going to do? And if you are, say, a routine shift worker, and you've been on shift work, say if you're 12 hours out of phase, like that example, it would take you at least 12 days to shift your circadian rhythm as far as you would possibly be able to shift it. And that's still not going to be right on. So for 3 to 4 hours, probably of that 12 hours, you're going to be dealing with just what I talked about. The rest of it, your body it'll be more shifted, and it'll be working sort of more in synchronicity. But you guys have it the worst. Cops are just totally screwed because you have your night shift, and then you have your stuff randomly you have to do during the day, right? Go to court or whatever obligations that they throw at you that you occasionally have to do, it's horrible.
Right.
It's the worst. It's the worst scenario I can think of.
Do you think? No, you're right. Because I was going to ask a follow up because I work roughly 4 hours. If I'm on night shift, I'm working 4 out of 7 days. I'm working a night shift, but I have a family and young kids. So those other 3 days, I am a quote unquote normal person with normal hours, and I'm going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Not only just every 4 months when we rotate shifts, but within the week itself. And I've done a lot to implement some of your recommendations from the last time we talked, and I'm certainly improving, and diagnosing the sleep apnea was a huge issue, but still struggle with that. And so that jumps to another topic, and then you mentioned adrenal fatigue. I want to get to that too. But I notice, maybe being a little older, a little more mature possibly, that at the end of a 4-month night shift, I have some very not physiological, but also mental symptoms, or I don't want to say behaviors necessarily, but things that are consistent with what a psychologist talks about as a depressive state or depression. and not
Yeah.
in a full-blown sense, but I've become very acutely aware of that. And what is that? Can you explain that? And I don't want to take up too much time with it, but I'm curious about it because I see it in me, and because I see it now, at least I can manage it a little bit and be aware of it. But I see it in others too.
Yeah. So an interesting thing about that is there's a book I'd highly recommend you reading called Chronotherapy, and I can get you the author for the show notes if you have a hard time finding it. I want to say it's out of Stanford. Might not be. It's either an Ivy League school or Stanford. Pretty sure Stanford. They basically make this really convincing case that every major depressive disorder or major depressive episode that they find in people is preceded by a period of insomnia. And then depending on whether you're a typical depressive or an atypical depressive, you'll either have more insomnia or excessive sleep, what we call hypersomnolence. This is actually kind of a good time to bring in the adrenal fatigue, because it all ties together. So when you're on shift work, regardless of how much sleep you're getting, because you are outside of your circadian rhythm, and for you, you're totally hosed, right? You're doing 4 days. By the end of that 4 days, you've maybe shifted your circadian rhythm a maximum of 4 hours. If everything went great, now you take 3 days off of that, you go back 3 days at least, right? And now you're starting. So like the best you're ever getting is, maybe 4 hours of a shift, and then you're shifting back and shifting back and shifting forward. And we have these hormones in our bodies that are designed to compensate for that, essentially. But everybody thinks of cortisol as this evil hormone. Get rid of cortisol, and you're dead, right? Like literally, that's a definitive diagnosis for being dead, is having a cortisol of 0. Cortisol, along with epinephrine and norepinephrine and aldosterone that are and DHEA that our adrenals are secreting, they have a purpose, and what that purpose is to keep us alert in proportion to our environment. So when you're sleep deprived, your brain isn't working all that great. Your body's energy levels are low because your testosterone level is low. Your thyroid level has been compromised. Your neurotransmitters have changed. Your testosterone is low. Your growth hormone is low. You're not very anabolic. You're hyperinflamed. So your body doesn't really feel like doing what it needs to do, especially for you. Like if you have to jump out of cars and chase bad guys or something, that's something your body isn't really willing to do at that point. And the way your body does it is ramping up the adrenal hormones, and that this is what causes the fight or flight that we talk. That most of your audience has probably heard of, right?
Sure.
This extreme, that's sort of maximum adrenal level. So your adrenals try to compensate for your lack of sleep, but that leads to higher stress hormones, right? And higher stress hormones lead to a couple of things. Cortisol leads to chronically elevated blood glucose, which then leads to the whole insulin sensitivity issue that we've talked about. Also, cortisol impairs your prefrontal cortex, your decision maker, like we talked about, affects the perfusion, the blood flow to that, and the glucose utilization of that area of your brain. Cortisol also makes you hypersensitive to epinephrine and norepinephrine, makes you more sensitive to the hormones that the other stress hormones you're secreting. And stress probably isn't the greatest word, but I'm just using that because that's what they're called. And that leads to these little anxiety pings that people who are chronically sleep deprived for some reason just like all of a sudden feel super anxious about nothing, and they can't explain why. That's just an adrenal rush. So the documentation of the correlation between depression and insomnia is very clear that the correlation exists. I don't think anybody has worked out exactly what the mechanism is, but we know that sleep deprivation alters neurotransmitters. And our brain is essentially just this big bag of hormones. I mean, neurotransmitters are really just kind of hormones for cells, for brain cells. And if you start shifting those, you start shifting the way the brain behaves. And that leads to depression, and it leads to anxiety, and it leads to mood regulation issues. So getting super angry or getting super offended or super depressed, like in a flash, is very common. And I saw it with the SEALs all the time, and I see it with the uber wealthy serial entrepreneurs, and I see it with law enforcement and first responders, firefighters, like everybody who lives in that, and doctors just as bad. I mean, you think about ER doctors, they have horrible shifts. Like I've tried to help people, and their staff is so resistant to changing their schedule, and I'm like this. I'm like, you're worse than anybody else in the whole country, and you're doctors. You're supposed to be the gatekeepers of health, which I would argue that doctors really aren't, and that kind of speaks to one of the questions that we said we were going to talk about, but
yeah. And it kind of puts my head in my hands, and I have when I have a conversation like this, and I think we're screwed. I mean, there's nothing I can do about, like, I told this story on a different podcast, maybe it was even the one you were on, but I'm going through these problems, and some nurse was like, "Well, why can't you just work day shift?" It's like, well, someone's got to work the night shift, and it just so happens with my department that we all rotate. Cops, we have to work at night. We have to work.
You can't convince the criminals to quit working at night, right?
Yeah, they don't work.
Look, if you guys would just quit committing crimes at night.
Working 9 to 5, Monday through Friday would be fantastic for everybody. But, I mean, we got to work at night. We got to work in bad conditions. We are predisposed to, like, nutrition issues that are a challenge. Even if we're doing our best with sleep, it's still not the sleep we need. There's a whole. I mean, but I see how that rabbit hole happens, and then how you end up with bad decision making in crisis. How you end up with excessive force when you snap. How you end up with low morale department wide because everyone is taxed. How you end up with the average age
violence,
of
domestic
violence, divorce, suicide, all those issues that we deal with. The average age of a heart attack for a cop is 49. Versus I think 67 for the standard citizenry. It blows my mind how much all of this.
You guys live like 14 to 16 years less than the average.
Yeah. Scary, right? I mean, it's so
that's scary.
It just so happens that after we finish here today, I'm going into my general to sit down after some advanced blood work and kind of try and figure some of this out. So some of this is on my mind, but it's like, how do we manage this? How do we even begin to deal with this? And so maybe that's my next question is, you mentioned before something like 82 sleep disorders that are out there, and your general physician's only going to know a small handful. Yeah. What recommendations do you have for people to go out and investigate these things on their own? What questions should they be asking their doctor? And I found, and this is no fault of my doctors, but I had the same experience you talked about, was that I had to be a bit of my own advocate, and I had to do some research, and I had to ask for a sleep study, even though he was somewhat reluctant to do it. He offered, and of course, I end up with severe sleep apnea. What are some of the things you would recommend people have their conversation with their doctor?
Well, I'd first start out with the caveat that their doctor it's very unlikely that their doctor knows anything about sleep. It's just not something that's taught. I mean, there are physicians obviously that specialize in sleep, and they know a hell of a lot about sleep, and they know a hell of a lot more than I do about sleep disease. And those are the guys you need to go to with sleep disease and disorders. But by and large, what we're talking about here is lifestyle, right? And your physician can't make 2 + 2 not equal 4. No, I mean, no matter how smart your physician is, shift work is bad for you physiologically. We know that. The World Health Organization has recognized it as a type 2 carcinogen. We know it, and then highly suspicious for correlations with heart attack, stroke, pretty much every disease we know of, diabetes, obesity, blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, really what I would say that the key, if I were in your shoes and I didn't know what I know and I want to go talk to my physician about it, I would talk to my physician about the things that I've been telling you, that you've heard this on podcast, or you've read this, or whatever the most convincing sort of thing is for you. I think as long as you're passionate and convinced about it, you'll compel your doctor to do right by you. But I would just measure all of these things that we've been talking about, right? I would get the most complete blood panel that you can. I would focus very heavily on measuring my sleep in some fashion, so that I have some idea of knowing how much sleep I'm getting, and I'm honest with myself about how much sleep I'm getting. I would make sure that I know what my insulin sensitivity looks like, my fasting blood glucose, what my inflammatory markers look like, what my sex hormones look like, all of my anabolic hormones, my thyroid, my cortisol, all of the stress hormones, all of the sex hormones, all of the inflammatory markers, and from there, and again, I hate to chase numbers. That's not really the idea. It's the gestalt, right? So you look at it and you say, this overall looks good. This overall looks like crap. It looks like this process is going on. Let's see what we can do. I'm hyper inflamed. I'm going to change the way I work out, right? I'm going to do like a less taxing, less inflammatory workout. I'm going to make sure I take my fish oil. Maybe I'm going to take glucosamine and chondroitin. I'm going to take gluten out of my diet, or refined carbohydrates, or whatever. You're going to control your inflammatory cascades that way. Anything to do with your sex, your anabolic hormones being low.
Doc, you cut out right there real quick. I think you just said anything
more
with
sleep is the answer, but also high intensity interval training helps as well.
You cut out right there real quick.
Probably the key.
Sorry, I wanted to make sure I understand. You said sex hormones.
Okay, you've been cutting out, and you're telling me I'm cutting out, so I haven't heard what you said.
Oh, I'm sorry. We're bad connection for a second. I think you said the last bit there was the sex hormones, or stress hormones, one of the two, and then high intensity interval training. Can you pair that up real quick?
Right. Yeah. So the stress hormones are going to need to be controlled through stress. Reduction of stress, and I highly recommend something that's quantifiable, like a heart rate variability training device, or the Megawave. I really like it. Measures sympathetic and parasympathetic. We can go down that rabbit hole if you want. But I'd make sure that my stress hormones were in line. I'd make sure that my insulin sensitivity was good, and that's primarily nutrition, but it's also sleep. But when you see low sex hormones or low anabolic hormones, there's only a couple of solutions for that. And the primary solution for that is to get more sleep. You can, of course, increase anabolic hormones by doing high intensity interval training, but those also lead to inflammation and lead to breakdown. And if you're getting poor sleep and you're already hurting, then that's counterproductive to do it that way. I don't like when I work with the client, when I take a client on as a new client, I don't make any diagnoses until we've optimized their sleep, nutrition, exercise, and stress control. So just keep focusing on those things and get them as good as they can possibly be before you start trying to chase down any type of diagnoses. And you can use those labs to sort of let you know how successful you are. And most people have some idea of how good their lifestyle choices are,
Sure.
And they can educate themselves further on it. But of course, all the sleep hygiene stuff that we talked about, supplements to make sure that you're getting the best quality of sleep and that you're replacing sort of the usual suspects that might go deficient when you're chronically sleep deprived or you have chaotic sleep sort of in your situation. But you just need to know that doctors are called healthcare providers, and I think it's a misnomer. They're disease care providers. So when you have a disease, you want to see a doctor because they know how to diagnose it and they know how to treat it. When you want to be healthy, you don't want to see a doctor. Doctors they don't know much about health. We aren't trained that much. Some doctors do, but these are doctors who've taught themselves that, or they've sought out that education on their own. So unless you have an exceptional doctor, like a general general practitioner that's been trained in typical Western fashion doesn't know anything about sleep and doesn't know very much about nutrition and doesn't know much about exercise and doesn't know much about stress mitigation. So you're kind of on your own. You're better off working with some sort of life. Yeah, some sort of life coach or really smart trainer, who kind of has all the pieces of the puzzle, and highly trained trainer, or a life coach, I think it's a better solution than a physician. And then once you've optimized all those areas, and you keep chasing those lab markers, if there's something that just stays aberrant, and you're like, look, this is the best lifestyle I can possibly live. Then that's when you see your doctor, and he helps you manage the bridge between reality and ideal. I mean, most of us can't live an ideal life.
Right. I don't know if there's such a thing anymore, right?
Yeah.
Real quick, you said the device is called a megawave? We don't need to get into what it is, but
Omega wave.
And then you brought up a good question that I hadn't even thought to ask, but we do kind of historically tend to look to doctors as having the holy grail of information on any topic and related, but there's I think a reluctance sometimes to seek out information that doesn't have an MD next to the name, but I've found to be somewhat unfortunate. But we all have to go through this process of vetting who some of these people are and some of the legitimacy. I mean, I know that you have a close relationship with Rob Wolf, for example, whose book was the first book I read on the paleo diet and the whys and all that. And after reading that, went strict paleo for a bit of time and had great blood markers as a result. But who are some of those other people? Rob Wolf obviously is one, but who are other people that you would direct people to if they are seeking out some of this information to be proactive without going to their doctor?
Man, there's a ton of good guys out there, and I'm really bad at holding names in my head, but I mean, Chris Kresser is a phenomenal guy. He's sort of an Eastern trained physician, so he's the Eastern version of MD and acupuncturist, but just really smart on nutrition, really smart on lifestyle. Even guys, who don't really necessarily have a medical background. I mean, like Mark Sisson puts out really great advice. John Wellborn puts out great advice. I mean, you just kind of, I'd say go to somebody's site like Rob, or you go to, my website, and I have a thing on there called Community, and there's probably 30 people listed in there that I consider sort of thought leaders in any of those areas: sleep, nutrition, exercise, or stress mitigation. And some of those people on there are also like the life coaches, kind of people that I was talking about. And not that you need to employ them as a life coach, because you have access to their podcast and their blogs and all that, and you can do as much of this stuff on your own as possible, because that's what a life coach is going to encourage you to do anyways. They're just going to kind of give you some accountability behind it. But I would get started and get a knowledge base first, and if you feel like you need help, hire one of those people. And if you feel like you're really badly off, and you don't really want to chase the traditional medicine route, anything sort of down the integrative or functional medicine path is probably more aligned with your audience that would be listening to this podcast, would be my guess.
This tends to be a very open audience. They want if they're listening to me 53 minutes in talking about sleep, nutrition, and all that health, they want to learn these things. We'll get to your website, and I want to talk about that too, because you just relaunched that. The biggest question I got though from listeners, I asked my email list what they wanted me to ask you about, and overwhelmingly it was supplements, and maybe it's because we tend to not address the big issue and we want to supplement it with an easier fix. But I talk on the show about how magnesium, vitamin D, and those two together have worked fantastic for me. And then playing with 5-HTP or GABA, one of the two, at night seems to have a very synergistic effect on being able to sleep well. But a question I got a lot was if you could touch on melatonin in long-term use, and if there's any negatives to long-term use. And of course, I think I know the answer to this, but what other options do you see that are out there?
Yeah, so I mean, you just about gave away my formula right there with with what you're taking, and there's good reason for that. Obviously, it's not any magic I came up with. It's
Well, it's
just
something I started taking after we talked last time.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it's, lo and
yeah,
behold, it works.
yeah. So um, yeah, the whole idea of supplements is like I've said a couple of times in the show. There's reality and there's ideals. Like, here's what I want to do. Here's what I can actually do. We supplement or mitigate in that gap, right? So naps would be mitigating for the sleep, and then taking some sort of sleep supplement would be supplementing to fill that, to improve that gap. But the melatonin question is really common. I would say for the first 5 years that I was, considered a sleep expert and did interviews and lectures and all that stuff. And back in those days, I was one of the people saying that taking exogenous, which just means outside in, taking melatonin from the outside and putting it inside your body, would decrease your own melatonin production. And I still think that's true. However, it has not borne out in any research that I've seen. And they have chased it. Their problem is they're chasing it with salivary markers, which may not be a very good indicator of what's in the brain. And that's where we need the melatonin. We need melatonin elsewhere, but that's sort of the big kickoff for the orchestra in the brain to deal with sleep. So I think it's probably true that taking too much melatonin will decrease your own melatonin production. If it's not true, it is literally the only hormone in the body that is that way. Every other hormone, if I give you that hormone, your body will quit making as much of that hormone. However, what we have established to be true is that, and there's lots of research to support this, is that taking melatonin from the outside in larger doses than your brain would ordinarily make leads to a downregulation of receptors. So this is a lot like that insulin thing we talked about at the beginning, right? It can be it can be the binder or the receptor itself that's causing the issue. And so if you have an excess of melatonin around all the for a sustained amount of time, then your body starts taking away melatonin receptors. Now, if you ever quit taking melatonin, your body's not as sensitive to melatonin, and your brain doesn't make enough melatonin because you don't have enough receptors to receive it. So now you have to wait until all your melatonin receptors come back. And from the time the sun goes down until the time the sun comes up, if you lived in a hunter-gatherer sort of perfect society, non-electric world, your brain is only going to produce about 6 micrograms of melatonin. So if you're taking a 5 milligram melatonin pill, you've gone way over what your body would make. Now you're not going to absorb 100% of it. So if you're taking a 1 milligram tablet and you're breaking that in half and you absorb maybe half of that, you're not doing nearly as badly. But that's my take on the melatonin. And then everything that you talked about, the vitamin D3, the magnesium, the tryptophan, those are all in the path of making melatonin. Those are all the constituent parts. There's one more that starts that whole thing, tryptophan, which is, we all know, associated with turkey and taking naps and Thanksgiving is the tryptophan coma because of that pathway, because there's an excess of tryptophan and you've put all your blood into your gut and there's some other things going on there and you feel like sleeping. And then the other sort of major game that goes on when we were talking earlier about slowing down your brain, decreasing your awareness of your environment, that's GABA's job. The problem is it's hard to get GABA across and into the brain, but taking regular GABA still helps because you have about a tenth of your brain in your gut, right? I mean, I didn't say that right, but you have about 1/10 of the number of neurons in your gut as you do in your brain. Gotcha. So you have this gut brain, which is also affecting your sleep and your stress control and adrenal control and all that other stuff. And some GABA does get into the brain, so it is helpful. And my product has something called phenyl GABA in it, which is GABA that has this little phenyl ring attached to it that allows it to get into the brain, and then it works like GABA as opposed to sleep drugs that are GABA analogs that are meant to work better than GABA. And those are the ones that are just really dissociative. They just kind of turn your brain off, and then there's all sorts of problems with that behaviorally, but it also affects your sleep architecture, and you don't get normal sleep. You get drugged sleep, which looks a lot like unconsciousness and not like sleep.
I don't want that. So
No.
if I remember vaguely, or just my lack of biology background, melatonin's a hormone, and that's why your body starts to produce less and less if you're putting it into yourself, right? And
Right.
vitamin D is also a hormone, right?
Yeah.
So
it was misnamed.
Are we at risk of doing the same thing with vitamin D as we are with melatonin by supplementing with it and then taking too much? Or what's that level of IUs, that a reasonable person...
So the difference with the vitamin D3 is that we don't have a vitamin D3 gland, right? Like there's no endocrine organ that's secreting vitamin D3. We're making that in our skin with exposure to the sun. Almost nobody gets the sun that we sort of evolved to get on a daily basis. But what you find, when they study people's blood work, they put them out in the sun, they study people's vitamin D conversion, and what it's converting vitamin D2, which you can get from your diet and your body can make, into vitamin D3, which can only be made, like I said, through the sun exposure to your skin. If you go outside and get sunlight to half your body, say like you take your shirt off and you go outside for 20 minutes, you make about 15,000 IUs of vitamin D3. The USRDA, I think, is 400 or 800 IUs or something like that. So if you're working inside all day and, not getting a lot of sun, 800 is nothing. I mean, right? Your 15,000 is about what your body uses. Interestingly enough, if you stay out in the sun for 4 or 5 hours, that 15,000 doesn't keep climbing up. It kind of shuts off and self-regulates, and you may be able to produce, 18, 20,000 tops. Because once you kind of hit, there's some sort of sensor of that your body, there's some sort of recognition of that level. That the other thing about vitamin D3 is that it's stored in our fat. So it's a fat-soluble hormone that is stored in our body fat, intended to be stored in our body fat. So it doesn't have to be in your circulation. So it's not going to your brain and telling your brain to make less vitamin D3, but your brain's really not even involved in it. And the brain is usually the regulating factor for downregulating.
Okay.
Downregulating how much you make of any hormone. So your brain's not involved in the production of vitamin D3, and it's stored in your fat. Is kind of the short answer.
Gotcha. Okay. No, I appreciate that. And I know we're running out of time. I had one more question, and then we'll get to your new launch of your new website and all that, if you have a second.
Yeah.
This was a good one. This one also came in. So another podcaster, fellow podcaster, probably the only thing we have in common is Jocko Willink, who you are good friends with. At least I take that based on the friendly rivalry the two of you banter back and forth with on Twitter. Jocko's podcast, the Jocko podcast, and his book Extreme Ownership have been. I know for a fact that many people who listen to the show, listen to Jocko's show, have read that book. I've recommended that book to many people. I've given it to a couple people. Anyway, that's who he is. Obviously, you two know each other from the SEALs, but I don't know if there's another way to ask how you know each other or how you came to be friends. But also, he's famous for posting that photo on Instagram every morning of his watch at like 4:30 wake up, right? And I think this morning it was even 3:30. Just kind of insane. And there's definitely a dynamic of a certain kind of cop that wants to be out there, a certain kind of person, a serial entrepreneur like you mentioned, who just wants to be out hustling and sleep less. Kind of is the argument. You need to make more time, so sleep less. I see sometimes this discussion or some of these people post this stuff up on Twitter, and they're aspirational to be like to Jocko and kind of point to you and say, well, if he can do it, why can't I do it? And what's your response to that sort of desire to go, but also maybe some of that what would you say to a fan of his that wants to be like that grinder, wake up, no sleep kind of guy?
Well, I would say that, it's probably unlikely that Jocko is a genetic outlier for his need for sleep. Jocko is just an an extraordinarily, probably pathologically determined guy, and he's just a super intense, very driven, very ambitious kind of dude. And he's, if you listen to Jocko's message, Jocko is an absolutist, and he knows he's an absolutist, and he doesn't try to tell anybody that they're going to be healthier by sleeping this much.
Yeah, he never claims that.
He's trying to encourage them to be ambitious. And I think if you and Jocko's my jiu-jitsu instructor as well. We've known well before his book came out, and way well before his podcast came out, and well before he sort of achieved this his level of fame that he's boomed out of in the last 6 months or so. We've known that we philosophically disagree on this. But all I can tell you is that if you want to go after that, and sometimes you have to go extreme to achieve what you want, right? Like, I didn't get through SEAL training by being balanced. I didn't get through medical school by being balanced, right? I went extreme and I paid the price for it. And that's the lesson of life. Like, you can do anything as long as you're willing to pay the price. So, I mean, if you want to follow the Jocko mantra and like see how much you can take, just realize that the way you're going to know how much you can take is when you break yourself, and then there's going to be some recovery from that. Jocko's an amazingly resilient guy to be able to do what he does. I think he's probably unusually resilient, and that most people aren't going to be able to sustain that for very long. And definitely, I mean, Jocko's my age. Most guys are age cannot withstand what Jocko does to himself. Maybe Jocko's going to shatter one day. Maybe he's not. Maybe he's going to prove me wrong. But I can't say that in the research, when we bring people into the labs and we sleep adapt to people and we control their sleep, and then we test them, and then we take away a little bit of sleep, and then we test them in any metric, nobody does better with less sleep at anything. And every hour of sleep that you give up, you lose about an hour and 15 minutes of productivity. So it's a negative sum gain. And you will, like we talked about, it's almost certainly the reason that cops die 14 years earlier, because we know that people who take sleep drugs chronically happen to die 14 years earlier on average as well. And I don't think that's a coincidence.
Yeah, no, it most certainly isn't, and I've learned that, and I get it reinforced every time I hit record for the podcast. So, last time we talked, you you'd already launched the sleep cocktail, but you've relaunched it now. You've relaunched your website, as you mentioned. It's docparsley.com. Parsley like the herb, Parsley.
Yep.
You now call it the sleep remedy, right? And it's I mean, I could tell it, but it's more interesting to hear it from you. Real quickly, what is the sleep remedy? And you already talked about why you developed it, I guess, and I don't want to rehash that for everyone. They can go to episode 10 to listen to, the SEALs kept coming to you and asking for this, but it's available on your website now. And you talked a little bit about the GABA that was in it. What other things have you developed with it over the last year since we talked?
So the formulation of the relaunch is exactly the same. I am testing some other formulations to try to control a few other neurotransmitters involved. But all the formulation is exactly what we talked about. It's the production pathway of melatonin, and it's a light dusting of melatonin, and it's that form of GABA that can cross into your brain. So it's tryptophan, 5-hydroxytryptophan, vitamin D3, magnesium, very small dose of melatonin, and a little bit of this pH GABA, and it helps you initiate sleep. Everything in there kind of washes out of your brain pretty quickly, though, washes out of your system pretty quickly. So it doesn't necessarily maintain sleep. If if stress is, waking you up 4 hours after you go to sleep, it's probably still going to happen when you take this. And those people I tell, don't take it until you wake up,
Right.
and then you can help reinitiate the cascade. But, there's no sort of physiological tricks or hacks in it or anything. It's just meant to give your brain everything that you need to start that cascade. If your sleep hygiene isn't ideal, if you can't sort of get rid of all the light in your eyes and slow your brain down 3 hours before bed, and then have sort of the perfect sleep environment and all that, which a lot of people can't, then it's a good supplement to kind of make sure that you initiate sleep quicker and that it's normal, sort of quality sleep, and hopefully result in you getting more sleep. And lots of people do, not that the product's actually doing it, but the product's helping them initiate good sleep architecture, so the quality of their sleep is higher, so they end up sleeping longer. Mm-hmm. But it's not the product really making them sleep longer, because it's just not around anymore. It doesn't last that long. And the only reason we changed the name is cocktail had this connotation to a lot of people that it had alcohol in it. And it was blocked by a ton of firewalls. Corporate municipalities and DOD, DOJ, and all that stuff would block it because of the word cocktail.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah,
we changed it to Sleep Remedy.
So you just relaunched the website. I'll link to both Sleep Remedy and your website. There's some good articles up there that go a little deeper in depth. I like your thought leadership in your community there. What's next for you? What do you have on the horizon?
Well, I'm negotiating a book deal right now for the book that's been in the
Yeah, we're cutting out again, but book deal, I heard that.
I'd say it's 90% written, 90% written, something like that, depending upon the publisher. I hope to you want me to re-say it, the book? We're working, negotiating a book deal. Am I cutting out again?
No, I think I was, but we're caught up to each other, I think.
Okay. And I will, in the next 3 months or so, kind of pull myself away from the sleep supplement day to day. It's been running for about a year now, and I know enough about how it runs to be able to hire somebody to do all the crap that I don't need to be doing, which is about 90% of what I do for the company. I'm not the right guy to be doing it. So I'll bring somebody in, kind of take all that off my plate, and then I'll do more lectures, more information products, more corporate consulting, and professional consulting, and all that type of stuff, and take on a few more clients. I've taken my client list down to a pretty small number right now, just because I've been so busy with everything else. So, yeah, in short, I'll sort of go back to doing what I know how to do, and quit trying to run a supplement company, which is not what I know how to do.
Right. Yeah, that sounds challenging. So docparsley.com, where can people find you on Twitter and Instagram, or anywhere else on social media that they can follow your thoughts?
You can hit that off my website. I think I'm at Doc Parsley on both of those.
I'll link to it in the show notes. I think on Instagram you're actually just at Kirk Parsley, and then Twitter you're Doc Parsley.
Could be, yeah. I suck with.
Tell you what, I'll figure it out for you, and then I'll post it in the show notes.
Okay,
and I'll have it on there. Doc, thanks.
You saved me. See,
there you go.
Just feign a little helplessness there, and I get everything.
I do that with my wife all the time. I pretend I don't know how to do something, and then she can do it for me.
I don't know. I don't know how to take the trash out.
And honey, if you're listening to this, that's not true. I'm just saying that just to connect with the doc. Anyway, Doc, thanks for being back on the show. Really appreciate your support of law enforcement. You've been very vocal in that. You've been very vocal in your desire to help. Appreciate the fact that you offered to come back on, and you came back on. And you're 27-ish episodes since your first appearance. So appreciate you coming back and being true to that. I love following your stuff on Twitter. You put out a lot of good information. You have a good discussion with people going back and forth. So again, the show notes, but at Doc Parsley, DOC Parsley. People should follow that and see your thought process and learn a lot more about you. And then also check out those episodes you've done with Rob Wolf on his podcast. I'll link to those as well, because I think there's a whole ton of information in there that goes way deep on stuff that I'm not even able to articulate. So best of luck to you with the book. I think it's been a lot of fun, and thank you for all of these topics. This is fantastic.
Yeah, man, it's my pleasure. And anyone silly enough to give me a soapbox to stand on, I'll go on their show and scream my message out there. So,
well, my soapbox has an open invitation to come back yet again because, like I say, you're a very popular guest, and people are always hitting me up with questions, and I always have questions because this is not something I'm going to solve until I'm probably retired.
Yeah. Well, I mean, rest assured, the more I've learned about sleep, the more of an idiot I feel like I feel like I know less and less the more I learn. So I don't think we'll figure it out anytime soon, but we can keep getting closer.
All right, thanks for listening to this episode with Doc Parsley. To follow us on Instagram, it's at The Squad Room, and same for Twitter. You can also text The Squad Room, all one word, to 44222, and you can get signed up for our mailing list right from your phone. And as always, if you think that the show is valuable or you think that the content that we're putting out there is worthy, please consider leaving a review on iTunes and consider a 5-star review. That really helps us spread the word of the show and get our message out to more and more law enforcement officers who need to hear these kinds of things and need to understand things like why you need to care about your glucose and why you need to care about your insulin and all those factors that just don't seem to be all related. But as we learn through the now 30-plus episodes of the show, it absolutely is. It all is related. Also, of course, want to make sure that we thank SB Tactical and the iCombat Active Shooter Training System for their support of the show. Check them out at sbtactical.com and check out the iCombat Pro in-home individual officer program. So give us a review on iTunes if you would. You can always check us out at thesquadroom.net. And if you have any questions, feel free to shoot us an email, squadroompodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, please take care of each other and stay safe.